Kaliningrad has been cut off from Europe. Again. The last time we discussed this region, the Baltic states had disconnected their power grid, plunging the area into darkness. But this time, it's not the lights going out. It's something far more important.
Welcome to Europe's latest headache.
Now, the Lithuanian government is pledging to block the rail transit from mainland Russia to Kaliningrad.
And these trains are arriving half empty.
On October 31st, Lithuania made an announcement that shocked the Kremlin. After decades of cooperation, Lithuania abruptly announced it would halt the rail transit of Russian petroleum products. This essentially cuts Kaliningrad's supply lines, rendering the area vulnerable and a significant liability for Putin.
The Kremlin has accused Lithuania of hostile actions.
This is a story about sanctions and borders, but it's shaped by conflict and a fracturing continent.
Now, to be clear, Kaliningrad's vulnerability isn't just about this restricted fuel. It's about geography. Look at a map of the place. This 98-mile-long Kremlin exclave is cut off from mainland Russia, bordered by Poland and Lithuania, both of which are NATO members. There is no direct land route to the area unless you go through Belarus, and even that brushes the Suwalki Gap, one of the most militarized corridors in Europe. What this means is that this area is a supply chain death sentence for Russia. Everything from fuel, food, spare parts, and medicine must cross foreign territory or come by sea to get to the area. Essentially, this Russian fortress only works if the supply lines do. And right now, that seems to be a problem. And at this point, you're probably thinking, well, how did Russia get land that's disconnected from the rest of the country anyway? Honestly, given the ridiculous nature of the supply routes, it's a fair question. So to understand how we got here, let's rewind the tape a bit. Kaliningrad wasn't always Russian. It was Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia, until 1945. After World War II, Stalin annexed it, expelled the Germans, and repopulated it with Soviets. For decades after that, it was a Soviet military hub, shielded by the Warsaw Pact. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, everything changed. And I mean everything. Russia lost its buffer zone as Lithuania and Poland broke away from the Union. By 2004, both had joined NATO and the EU. Overnight, Kaliningrad went from inner sanctum to geopolitical orphan, separated from the heartland but still armed to the teeth. It also created a situation where the area was now dependent on neighbors who could control what came in and out of the area as they wished. Since then, it's remained a strategic outpost, and that's the paradox. The more Moscow invests in Kaliningrad's military and defenses, the more the region depends on routes it doesn't control. And Kaliningrad's military role is no small matter, by the way. This small area is home to the Baltic Fleet, which gives Russia a powerful presence in the Baltic Sea. Iskander missiles that are capable of carrying nuclear warheads dot the landscape like flowers in a garden. Radar stations watch the entire region, forming a defensive shield for Russia's western flank, just in case, something starts. But here's the catch. All that firepower needs fuel, spare parts, and constant maintenance. The same roads and railways that carry military gear also bring in groceries, medicine, and construction material. The point in me telling you all this is that the fortress only works if the supply lines do. Kaliningrad, for all of its military might, is a masterpiece in supply line dependency, and when those lines are disrupted, no amount of tough talk can patch those cracks. And just to add further weight to this point, Kaliningrad isn't just a military base. It's home to nearly 1 million people. Civilians live in the shadow of radar towers and missile silos. Schools, hospitals, and apartment blocks share space with naval facilities. Bases run on diesel that comes from Russia. Shops stock goods that travel the same railway lines as military cargo. It's a dual identity, part fortress, part hometown. What looks like a normal logistics network is actually a pressure point waiting to be pressed. And when that network is disrupted, it's not just an inconvenience. It's a chain reaction that punishes both the military and civilians alike. And that's exactly what Lithuania has done. It has added to the pressure point. On October 31st, the state railway LTG announced that starting on November 21st, it would stop transporting Russian petroleum products from sanctioned companies like Lukoil and Rosneft. The message was clear. No more fuel, no more exceptions. This wasn't some sudden shift. The EU banned Russian oil transit back in 2022, but Lithuania had granted a temporary pass to keep Kaliningrad supplied for humanitarian needs. Well, that pass is now gone. It was swept away by fresh US and UK sanctions targeting Russia's energy giants. Lithuania didn't even try to stall or soften the blow. It aligned with the sanctions and shut the gate. The numbers show how fast things changed. In 2024, Lithuania moved 371,000 tons of Lukoil fuel to Kaliningrad. This year, that had dropped to 194,000. As of now, it's zero. The tap is off, and there's no backing down. Officials say they're simply following the law, fulfilling EU obligations and honoring Western sanctions. But Moscow sees it as something else entirely. What it sees is a calculated squeeze on Kaliningrad, exploiting its geography and isolation. To add injury to insult, the timing couldn't be worse. Winter is closing in, and Kaliningrad's fuel reserves are limited. At this point, every delay chips away at its ability to function. What was once a proud outpost of Russian power is now scrambling to keep the engines running. With one announcement, Lithuania turned a quiet rail corridor into a pressure valve, and it's not letting go. Now, interestingly, it's not just Lithuania. Poland wasn't sitting on the sidelines either. Over the past few months, it had tightened border controls and slowed freight traffic linked to Russia and Belarus. That has made it harder for Kaliningrad to rely on Polish railways for fuel and industrial supplies. Poland has long been a key route for Kaliningrad's precious cargo. This covers diesel, lubricants, metals, and all the essentials that keep the region's docks and industries moving. But now, inspections are tougher, delays are longer, and the margin for error is shrinking. Lithuania has already blocked fuel shipments, and Poland isn't far behind with more restrictions. And when both neighbors start pulling levers at the same time, Kaliningrad doesn't have too many options left. You see, Russia had counted on splitting the load between Lithuania and Poland, but it's safe to say that plan is falling apart. Logistics has now slowed down to a trickle. For a region built to project power, that kind of squeeze is pretty hard to ignore. This shows that Kaliningrad doesn't have the luxury of easy detours. When its neighbors tighten the rules, the logistical nightmares begin. Behind the scenes, the price tag for this logistical failure is mounting fast. To keep Kaliningrad supplied, Moscow has been forced to subsidize emergency shipments across the Baltic ferries, barges, and even small tankers repurposed for cargo. Each ton of diesel now costs the Kremlin nearly twice what it did a year ago. And though officials in Moscow rarely admit it, every extra ruble spent keeping Kaliningrad running is a ruble not being spent on the front lines or on domestic welfare. And believe me, both areas certainly need these funds desperately. The enclave, once an asset, has become a budgetary drain. Local fuel depots now rely on irregular deliveries that are burning through Moscow's emergency reserves. The Russian finance ministry has quietly authorized new transport credits to cover regional resilience costs. This is a bureaucratic phrase that really means keep the lights on in Kaliningrad at any price. Pretty crazy, right? What was once a showpiece of power is becoming a costly obligation, a stranded fortress that keeps demanding more ships, more fuel, and more money just to stay functional. Because of the pullback, Kaliningrad has been hit hard and fast. Before this, nearly 40% of Kaliningrad's refined fuel used to arrive by train from Lithuania. Those trains weren't just convenient, they were essential. Rail is faster and cheaper than ferries, and it keeps the region's supply chain moving smoothly. So when the trains slowed, everything else did as well. Deliveries dragged, fuel prices climbed, and industries that rely on diesel or specialized oils began to feel the pinch. In a place where timing is tight and storage is limited, even small delays ripple through farms, factories, and transport systems like a dropped wrench in a running engine. As much as local refineries can try to help, they can only do so much. The system relied heavily on imports, and those imports have become tangled in delays and restrictions that no one in Kaliningrad can control. Lithuania tried to keep the tone measured. Officials emphasized that they were acting within the law, not trying to provoke anyone. But legal language doesn't fill gas tanks or keep buses on schedule. For people in Kaliningrad, the impact wasn't generalized, it was personal. Between the shortages, the struggles, and the differences, the frustration builds. And as it does, the question on everyone's mind has been pretty simple. When will things get back to normal? As the crisis deepens, Russia's countermoves have started to take shape. The Kremlin's reaction has been fast, loud, and full of threats. Officials have called the blockade a hostile act and framed it as a part of a Western plan to weaken Russia. On TV and in the papers, Moscow's message has been clear. Lithuania isn't acting alone, it's just doing NATO's dirty work. Russian media has hammered this point home, warning that Kaliningrad residents are paying the price for Europe's aggression. Kremlin-aligned outlets painted the blockade as part of a NATO plot to strangle Russia's economy. Lithuania was even cast as a pawn, doing the bidding of Brussels and Washington. The Russian Foreign Ministry accused Lithuania of economic aggression, while Lukoil called the disruption politically motivated. There were threats too: cyber attacks, increased transit fees, and other forms of retaliation. But behind all the bluster, the Kremlin still had to find practical fixes. One idea was to send more goods and fuel by sea. Now technically that works. In fact, ferry traffic has jumped by 15% since the cutoff. But ferries are slow, costly, and vulnerable to bad weather. They can't match the volume or reliability of trains. And in winter, ice or storms can stop them completely. Russia has also hinted at retaliation through things like cyber attacks, trade restrictions, or higher fees on goods crossing its borders. But each of those comes with its own risks. For example, a cyber attack could spiral into something much bigger. And even then, not even Moscow's hackers can conjure up a full tank of diesel. So the Kremlin has looked for another route. And that's when the idea that maybe Belarus could help comes into view. After all, Belarus is one of Russia's closest allies. Unfortunately for the Kremlin, even that path hasn't been simple. Belarus was supposed to be Russia's safety net. If Lithuania ever caused trouble, Moscow could always count on the rail line running through Belarus, the one that carried over 1 million tons of goods every month straight into Kaliningrad. It moved everything from food and metals to plenty of diesel and gasoline. It was simple, efficient, and out of reach. Or at least that's what the Kremlin thought. Then came October 24th. Early that morning, something strange floated across the border. A huge helium balloon drifting from Belarus into Lithuania. At first it seemed harmless, but when it passed over a key radar station, authorities realized it was packed with hundreds of boxes of smuggled cigarettes and a tracking device. Well, that set off some alarms. Fighter jets scrambled, 2 major airports shut down for hours, and dozens of flights had to change course. Before anyone could even calm down, 3 more balloons appeared the same day, following the same route. For Lithuania, this wasn't some prank. It looked deliberate, a test, a message, and they weren't about to let it slide. 5 days later, on October 29th, they hit back hard by closing 5 out of 6 major border crossings with Belarus. Only 1 stayed open, and even that was limited to diplomats, passengers, and carefully approved cargo bound for Kaliningrad. Fuel trucks from Russia were completely turned away. It didn't take long for the impact to show. Within a short while, lines of trucks stretched for miles. Drivers idled for hours just to keep warm, burning through the very fuel they were trying to deliver. Belarus retaliated almost immediately, banning all European Union trucks from using its roads, which left even more vehicles stranded on the wrong side, their cargo spoiling as they waited. The result was chaos. Freight moving through Belarus to Kaliningrad dropped by more than 2/3 in just a few days. Trains that used to take a day and a half suddenly crawled forward, delayed by endless checks and conveniently missing paperwork. Ferries tried to step in, but the port simply couldn't handle the volume. Add in the bad weather, and the whole system began to choke. Russia may be almost out of options, but it does have one backup plan already floating in the harbor. The Marshal Vasilevsky is a floating storage and regasification unit, and has been anchored off Kaliningrad since 2019. Moscow spent $300 million to deploy it as an emergency backup. On paper, it's impressive, capable of unloading 2.7 billion cubic meters of gas per year, enough to power the region if things go south. But there's a catch. It needs LNG tankers to deliver the gas, and those tankers need ice-free water and calm seas to dock safely. In November of 2025, the Baltic froze early. Icebreakers managed to clear a path, but only 2 shipments made it through that month. Each tanker carries about 170,000 cubic meters, which is just enough to keep Kaliningrad running for 12 days. And because the terminal's storage tanks are capped at 75% to leave room for emergencies, the buffer lasts barely a week. To make things worse, the crews have to heat the LNG to minus 162 degrees Celsius before it can be piped ashore, and every delay burns extra fuel just to keep the system functional. Local officials still claim the terminal makes Kaliningrad energy independent, but the reality is colder. It makes the region weather dependent, and this year, winter came early. That being said, there's a gas wildcard, one lifeline that remains for now. This is a pipeline from Belarus that runs through Lithuania to Kaliningrad. The current 10-year deal, signed in 2015, expires on December 31st, 2025. And with that deadline approaching fast, the pressure is building behind closed doors. Lithuania's Amber Grid and Russia's Gazprom are locked in negotiations. But this isn't a quiet technical discussion. Lithuania wants a shorter extension and higher fees. Right now, it earns between 12 and 20 million euros a year from the transit, and it's making it clear that if Russia wants to keep that gas flowing, they're gonna have to pay more. President Nausėda didn't mince words. He even said there's no reason not to extend the deal if it benefits Vilnius. That's not just a hint. It's a signal that Lithuania is ready to squeeze every drop of leverage from this pipeline. And this isn't just about 2 countries. The European Union is watching closely too. Lithuania was one of the first EU members to cut off Russian gas imports after the invasion of Ukraine, and it's not eager to give Moscow any breathing room. The pipeline to Kaliningrad is now a pressure valve, and every cubic meter of gas is part of a larger strategic game. For Kaliningrad, the stakes couldn't be higher. Heating systems, power plants, and industrial operations all rely on that pipeline. If the deal collapses, it's not just about cold homes. It's about blackouts, stalled production, and a population caught in the middle. Russia has few good options. Shipping liquefied natural gas across the Baltic is slow, expensive, and vulnerable to weather. Building new infrastructure would take years. And with fuel deliveries already disrupted, losing gas would push Kaliningrad from discomfort into crisis. So while the pipeline does still flow, it's no longer a guarantee. It's a countdown, and Lithuania is holding the clock. Because of all of this, Kaliningrad is feeling the squeeze from every direction right now. Lithuania's fuel blockade has slowed deliveries to a crawl. Ferries can't keep up. The weather keeps getting in the way, and the Belarus route, once Moscow's backup plan, is barely holding together. The region may still be packed with missiles and military hardware, but that doesn't mean much when trucks aren't moving and shelves are running bare. Power on paper doesn't fill tanks or feed people. At this point, it's not about military strength. It's about survival, fuel, food, and freight, and all three are running short. The shortages are hitting fast and hard. Prices have jumped across the board. Fuel costs are up nearly 40%, and shipping is a third more expensive than it was just weeks ago. Deliveries that once took days are now taking weeks. Grocery stores can't keep up, and industrial suppliers are missing deadlines left and right. Lines at gas stations stretch for blocks, while drivers idle nervously, hoping that there's still some left in the pumps when it's their turn. What was once a functioning supply chain now feels like a slow-motion breakdown. The longer it drags on, the more daily life turns into a waiting game. And all that waiting is wearing people down. Local industries, the heartbeat of the region, are being squeezed from all sides. Amber miners are losing profits as transport costs eat into every sale. Fishing crews are staying docked because diesel is scarce and refrigeration can't be trusted. Tourism, that's drying up too, as hotels and restaurants struggle to cover rising costs, and constant travel delays keeps visitors away. Even public services are struggling. City officials are juggling smaller budgets just to keep buses running and buildings heated. Every sector is bending under the same weight. Too few supplies and too many problems. As pressure mounts, the threat of losing the gas pipeline becomes even more real than ever. If negotiations collapse, it won't just be factories or buses at risk. Homes, schools, and power plants could all go cold. That uncertainty has cast a long shadow over the winter. Businesses are freezing investments. Families are holding back on spending, and conversations have shifted from frustration to fear. It's not just about higher prices anymore. It's about whether the heat will stay on when the temperature drops. All of this is starting to change the mood in Kaliningrad. People are frustrated, tired, and losing faith. Younger residents connected to the outside world through social media can see how different life looks just across the border. Older residents, even those who still defend Moscow, are running into the same empty shelves, the same fuel lines, and the same rising bills. No one is immune. And while the Kremlin keeps promising control, Putin's grip looks weaker by the day. Kaliningrad was supposed to be a showcase of Russian strength, a fortress in Europe. Now it's starting to feel more like a stranded island, and the cracks are showing. The question isn't whether people will push back, it's how much longer they'll stay quiet before they do. But the frustration runs deeper than shortages or schedules. It's about belonging. Kaliningrad's identity has always been uneasy, a Russian city on European soil, closer to Gdansk than to Moscow, built on layers of German, Prussian, and Soviet history. For years, that mix gave a unique openness. Residents could cross borders, trade with neighbors, or travel to EU cities with ease. That connection bred something subtle but powerful, a sense that Kaliningrad wasn't quite like the rest of Russia. Now, isolation is eroding that distinction. Students who once studied in Vilnius or Gdansk are cut off from universities abroad. Small traders who relied on weekend markets across the border have gone bankrupt. Social media is full of quiet resentment and posts about shelves emptying while lights across the border stay bright. For young Kaliningraders, the divide is no longer ideological. It's visible every day. And the longer this goes on, the more it risks turning a population that once looked both ways into one that questions why Moscow keeps choosing confrontation over connection. At the end of the day, Kaliningrad isn't collapsing, but it's definitely cornered. The fleet still sails, the missiles still sit in their silos, but the region's daily rhythm is breaking down. Fuel is scarce, deliveries are slow, and the power grids are stretched. What used to be a symbol of Russia's strength now runs on fragile supply lines and political guesswork. Zoom out and the picture gets clearer. Military hardware means little if you can't keep the lights on or the buses moving. Real power isn't just about who you can threaten, it's about what you can sustain. And Kaliningrad is struggling to sustain really much of anything. As the world watches, Kaliningrad has become something larger than a regional standoff. It's a mirror held up to Moscow's ambitions. a reflection of how power built on force can falter on logistics, and how geography can quietly humble empires. What was meant to remind Europe of Russia's reach now reminds Russia of its own limits. In that sense, this enclave tells a wider story. It's not just about sanctions, railways, or fuel shortages. It's about the slow unraveling of an era when military hardware defined influence. Kaliningrad once embodied Russia's strength. Now it reveals its fragility. And the longer the engines stay silent, the louder that truth becomes. Thanks for watching.